Thank you very much. And now the introduction. Jeff Chadwick serves as professor of archaeology and Near Eastern studies at the Brigham Young University Jerusalem Center on Mount Scopus. He also teaches at the branch of the same university in Utah and has been teaching in university programs for this university here in Israel regularly since 1982. He received his PhD in archaeology from the University of Utah Middle East Center in 1992. During the 1980s, he became affiliated with the American expedition to Hebron. During the 1990s, he worked on the supervisory staff of the Tel Mikne Kron excavations. Since 2001, he has been on the supervisory staff of the Tel Esafigat archaeological project, serving as field director in Area D of the Lower City and Area F of the Upper City. Thank you again. Our next speaker, Keimer, was a senior lecturer at Macquarie University, where he taught the archaeology, history, and languages of ancient Israel and the Near East. He co-directed excavation at Khirbet el-Rai and is the co-host of the Biblical Word podcast. His interests include the archaeology of the early Iron Age, the Hebrew Bible, and historical geography. The subject, the title of the talk is Tel en-Nasbeh in the Iron Age I. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My Hebrew isn't nearly as good as Jeff's, so I won't even try. And if you ask my wife, my English isn't even that good. But it's what I know, so I'll go with it. Well, thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak about the site of Tel en-Nasbeh, a site that was excavated nearly 100 years ago. And I've been reanalyzing a lot of the finds from the site, and there's really interesting material, and hopefully I can shed some light that hasn't been known about the site, particularly in the Iron I and even a little bit of the early Iron IIA period. Well, just to contextualize us, Tel en-Nasbeh is about 12 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Most people would identify it with biblical mitzvah, which features heavily in the accounts of 1 Samuel and a few other contexts. And it's a very strategic site, if you know the context. It sits right here on the north-south central ridge route that runs all the way through the central hill country. It also overlooks the route coming up the Beit Haron ascent and kind of guards traffic flowing east into the Jordan Valley. So it's a very strategic site, and what we'll see in the archaeology is that it was very important. Well, here you have a plan of the site, and it was excavated by William Frederick Bade from the Pacific School of Religion in California back in 1926. And he did 5 seasons that ended up in 1935. And in the process, they excavated approximately 70% of the site. So this is a very large exposure of a site that typically we just don't have this kind of exposure at most sites, let alone sites in the hill country. And even though some of the methodology was problematic and some of the preservation was problematic, it does allow us a very large corpus of material to understand this site, particularly in the Iron Age I. Well, before I focus on 3 specific types of material from the site that we can have new insights about, I did want to just bring up some of the limitations in working with the material that obviously come with a site that was excavated almost 100 years ago. And while I don't have time to go into all the limitations that are there, I want to highlight just a couple important ones. One of the first things I do want to point out is that of all the material that was published, and there are 2 final excavation reports that were published in 1947, a lot of the material that was excavated actually was never even published. And as Jeff Zorn has pointed out in his own dissertation on the site, and you heard him a few nights ago, in some contexts he notes that only about 15% of what was actually discovered is actually published. So there's a lot of material that is still in the storerooms at the Bade Museum in California and in the Rockefeller that has never been brought to light. Another issue with working with the material is that the conventions for recording it, and even in the publications, are not what we use today. So if you look at the pottery volume, they don't indicate if the pottery is slipped, or if it has red decoration, or if there are any kind of indentions or incisions in handles. This material, or this kind of aspect of publishing, just wasn't the norm back in the day. And so unless you go and look at the material itself, there's certain classes of material that you don't even know exists at the site. Another limitation is that over the course of the 5 seasons of excavations, they were slowly changing their methodology of how they recorded the material. And what we can reconstruct is that as they were digging material out, they would register it. Then sometimes they did this, sometimes they didn't actually do it this way. Later on, they decided we'll actually just register everything based on the type of vessel. So for us to try and reconstruct the date of the architecture that the pottery goes with is very complex and very challenging to do. Yet I'll make a case that there are some contexts where we can actually identify certain Iron I and maybe Iron IIA contexts at the site and connect it with broadly the architecture of the settlement. Now, again, I want to thank Jeff Zorn for his work, because he looked at the stratigraphy and was able to make more sense of it than they did back in the 20s and 30s. And if you are familiar with the site, they said that there are two layers at the site, 2 strata at the site that have 2 phases, maybe a little bit more. But if you look at the picture right here, just by counting, you see there are a few more stratigraphic layers than just 2. So they missed a few, and in Jeff's work, he was able to correct this based on the architecture and identified at least 5 layers, the most important of which, and which focuses for us, is stratum 3, and he broke that into 3 phases. Stratum 3C, which was the earliest, stratum 3B, and stratum 3A. So as far as we're concerned today, we're going to think about stratum 3C, the earliest iron level, if you will, that has any major architectural features. Well, let me jump into the types of material that we have at Tel en-Nasbeh that haven't been fully realized or fully processed. And the first are the punctured handles. And if you were here earlier for Shai Bar's discussion of the Mount Ebal site, you would recognize these handles here. And in fact, these were recognized at Tel en-Nasbeh, but nobody knew how many there were and the wide diversity of the types of impressions that we have. And so I've started to quantify this. I still am working through the records, so the numbers that I'm going to show you will actually continue to increase. But importantly, not only do we have these handles at Tel en-Nasbeh, which would be one of the southernmost sites where these handles are present, but we have a very wide range of the types of impressions. And you see I've highlighted many of the ones that we have, and these classifications come from a study done by Oren Cohen, where he looked at the distribution of these handles. And as you can see, there's at least 14, but I'm assuming there's going to be many more as I continue through the work, which would mean that this is a site that has more handles than most of the other sites that have these handles, aside from Shiloh and Mount Ebal. One interesting conclusion, of course, based on the distribution of these handles, is that both of those sites have some sort of cultic affiliation with them, and it raises the question of, well, did Tel en-Nasbeh also have some sort of cultic affiliation of some sort? We'll come back to this in a moment. Well, let's just jump to the next category of objects from the site, and these are the finger-impressed handles. Now, this is the type of pottery that nobody has actually recognized before at Tel en-Nasbeh. And in fact, in a study from a few years ago, they actually said these handles don't exist at Tel en-Nasbeh because if you look at the publications, they didn't draw the impressions. So unless you've gone and looked at the material, you wouldn't know that they're actually there. But I can tell you, there are thumb-impressed store jars, thumb-impressed cooking pots, thumb-impressed crater handles, thumb-impressed jar handles as well. And the kind that we have here with store jars are predominant beginning at the end of the Late Bronze Age and running into the early Iron Age 2A. And after that, they kind of taper off. So what we have here would fit most comfortably into an Iron I, Iron IIA context, even if I can't completely date them perfectly based on the stratigraphy. But as again, you see we have single impressions, double impressions, both vertically up the handle and horizontally across the handle. even this very interesting one with very wide impressions and triple impressions as well. So the whole distribution of these kinds of handles now has to factor in the presence of them at Tel en-Nasbeh. There are, I'll just mention very briefly, there are also, and even in greater quantity, thumb-impressed handles from cooking pots, but these are later, late Iron I and Iron IIB. And so it seems the phenomena goes from doing this on handles of storage jars to doing this on handles of cooking pots at a later point in time. Now, interestingly, if you start to plot out where these storage jars with the handles, storage jars, wrong button here, go back. They appear largely with around this ring here, and it's this type of architecture, the so-called casemate type wall that surrounds the site, that is Zorn's stratum 3C, that scholars have wondered, well, when was this actually built? And the debate ranges as to, well, maybe it was as early as the 10th century, maybe it's 9th century, before this is replaced by this massive outer wall. Well, moving on to our third category, I'm going to make a case that actually stratum 3C is even earlier and should have been found, or should be dated as a foundation, to even the 11th century. And that's based largely on the distribution of the Philistine pottery that we have at Tel en-Nasbeh. And the Philistine pottery is very significant. Not only is most of it produced in the coastal plain area, as David Ben Shlomo had shown through petrographic analysis and then brought to the site, but you have a lot of it, relatively speaking, for hill country sites. So if you just look at the distribution, it again shows up across the site. It doesn't show up just in one cluster or two clusters. It's everywhere that they got down to lower elevations in their excavations. And most of the times, this Philistine pottery also shows up with clusters of other Iron I pottery sherds and or vessels, which would make sense, and also gives us a better sense that the distribution of this pottery isn't just random or because of disturbances at the site, but it's an indication that it's associated in some way with the actual plan of the site in the Iron Age 1. Now, interestingly, there we go. How much do we have? Well, again, relatively speaking, in comparison to other highland sites, we have an exponentially larger amount of Philistine pottery than any other site in the hill country. In the original excavation report, they said we have 47 sherds, maybe a dozen more, and that's it. Well, I can tell you, just what I've looked at and seen physically, they have even more than that. And if you go through all their records, even if they don't have pictures or drawings of the pottery because they didn't keep it, there is even more Philistine pottery, upwards of 138 pieces of Philistine pottery. Now, some of that comes from the same vessel, so I tried to do a rough estimate of how many actual vessels might be there. 55 sounded like a good number to me, but if you compare that to every other site, right, the next closest site that has any is Bethel, and it has 12 sherds. 8 of those come from one vessel, as we know from the publication. So at most, they have maybe 3, 4 total vessels in the excavations that they did. And you might say, well, maybe it's because there's so much exposure at Tel en-Nasbeh, which is why you have so much Philistine pottery. And yes, there is a far greater exposure at the site if you look at how much was excavated at Bethel, at Tel, even Keimer-Iron. These are not small single squares. A decent representation of the site was excavated. So the fact that you have 0 pottery of the Philistine tradition at any of these other sites in the region of Benjamin, Judea, Samaria, is very telling. Now, you do get some at Jerusalem, but this is the so-called late Philistine decorated ware. So this is later, probably not even indicative of actual Philistine presence. So that means that really Tel en-Nasbeh is an anomaly with the amount of Philistine pottery that it has, and also the types of Philistine pottery that are there. So not only do we have open vessels, which you might expect with some trade, there's also closed vessels. There are craters, stirrup jars, jugs, strainer spouted jugs, feeding bottles. And the more interesting thing, at least I think that is telling, is the presence of items that are typically associated with Philistine cult. And that would be things like ring kernoi in the Iron Age 1, including many components of bird decorations or bird figurines. There are bird heads, there are bird wings, there are bird bodies that would go onto Kernoi that come from these contexts, again, largely with other Iron Age I material. There's also evidence of Kernos bowls. At least two, lion-headed cups, and you see the nose of one of those right here. There's possibly a couple fragments of Ashdota figurines, though it's debatable and difficult to know because there are later couch figurines in the hill country that look very similar. So even though the fragments are white-slipped and bichrome decorated, I can't be 100% certain that these are actually Ashdota figurines because none of the tops were found and no heads were found. The last thing, though, are some painted chalices. So if you look at the type of Philistine pottery, it's far broader than what you find at sites that are closer to the heartland of Philistia that are interacting with them. So why do we have, again, the quantity, the type of vessels, and the distribution? And my argument would be that we actually have a Philistine presence in this site in the Iron Age I. Now, just to give you a representation of the other types of Iron I pottery that comes with it, we have everything from kind of earlier forms that carry on the Canaanite tradition of the late Bronze Age through our early Iron IIA forms, but by and large, the large bulk of pottery would fit very comfortably within the 11th century. And again, this is the context where most of the Philistine pottery is associated with that. So whether it's bowls, pithoi, cooking pots, even craters, and again, some of these forms last longer than others, but kind of diagnostically viewed from the big picture, everything fits very nicely in the 11th century. So on the one hand, our punctured handles seem to indicate that en-Nasbeh has a connection to sites further north in the hill country, maybe has a cultic connection, but the Philistine presence seems to indicate a connection to the west in the Iron I. Now, if we add to that, there's actually several pieces of painted pottery that continue the Canaanite tradition from the late Bronze Age. Again, it seems to fit in better with the western connection than it does anywhere else in the hill country. So if we think about this in terms of maybe even the biblical text, well, are there any sites that you have the Philistine presence recorded or indicated in the biblical text, and is that site in any way cultic? And the answer actually is yes. If you read 1 Samuel, there's a site called Givat HaElohim where a Philistine garrison is located. Now, obviously, to bring in the biblical text requires discussion along textual lines, but if that text is remembering any accurate details from the Iron Age I, the archaeology goes very nicely with that. It also raises the possibility of connecting the site of Mitzpeh with Givat Elohim as well. So it's a cultic site, the so-called Hill of God, where the Philistines are located, and what we see in the material culture would seem to fit nicely with at least some of those details in those narratives. So to just wrap it all up, right, number one, en-Nasbeh has the largest amount of Philistine pottery in the central hill country. Again, the type of pottery, the amount of pottery, the distribution of the pottery, at least to me, would indicate that you actually have Philistines of some sort present at the site, particularly, again, since the pottery is being made in Philistia and being brought there. The punctured handles indicate some sort of connection further to the north. Also, the presence of these handles seem to go along with cultic sites, at least in two instances they do. And we now know that there are, in fact, finger-impressed store jars there that would date either to the Iron I or the early Iron IIA. So this is the wealth of going back and looking at the material that is there and hopefully providing some new insight on the nature of the early settlement at en-Nasbeh in the Iron Age I. So with that, I say thank you to the museums that have allowed me to access everything, and thank you.
Time for many questions. Sure. Okay, so we have 5 minutes for questions. Please.
I don't know part of that, no.
How can you explain the presence of Philistine pottery in the hill country, since we know that the Philistines inhabited only the lower parts of the country?
Yeah. So my guess at explaining why there's Philistine pottery there would be, if I had to reconstruct a kind of historical process, again, we have to rely on the biblical text with some of the details, and there are issues with interpreting it, but the picture you get from the text is that the Philistines are seeking to expand to the east and into the hill country. For what reason? I would assume economic reasons, but that's my assumption. The fact is, we don't know precisely, but for whatever reason, en-Nasbeh, because it is a very strategic site and does allow you to go north-south in the hill country and east-west into the Jordan Valley, makes it a very enticing site if one were to expand into that region and want to continue to expand into that region. As from a kind of military perspective, if you want to expand in such ways, this would be the site you would want to control to do that. So it makes sense in that regard.
Okay, more questions? Ken?
Is it possible to explain the pottery, the Philistine pottery, in a different manner? In other words, someone just made a killing, came up with a few donkey loads of pottery, sold them. You found them in one level, well distributed around the site.
So the question is, can we explain the presence of Philistine pottery in other ways than actual Philistines? Yes, I think we could. Again, I think the distribution of the pottery and the types of the vessels would indicate how, and it comes down largely to some of the cultic vessels. So the short answer to your question is yes, it's possible, and I can't prove my own thesis 100%, but we don't have any historic record necessarily of major battles between where people would want to bring the Philistine material culture up into the hill country. And if this is the case, if it's a practice that hill country peoples, the Israelites, are doing, why don't we find it at more sites, or why don't we find it in more quantity, presuming, obviously, that they might join in the battle? Again, there's lots of presumptions and a lot of assumptions that I'm making there, but at least at the time, I think that the most sense, or it makes the most sense to say that you actually have a small contingent. What that looks like, I don't know, but I think that it makes the most sense to say there's actual Philistines at the site. So.
Actually, I think there's one thing that a large portion of the Philippine vessels were actually named in the Judean islands, locally named. So that would be a good point for having Philistines in the side and not trade. There's another book which is made in the central coast, actually. So both locally made and traded.
Oh, yes, thank you. There's the man who did the analysis. So, yes, not all of the pottery was imported from the coastal area. You do actually have local-made Philistine pottery as well. And again, who is making it in this tradition? Are Israelites randomly picking it up and starting to make it in this tradition? Possible, but unlikely. And so you, again, might have evidence then that there's actually Philistine potters that are at the site.
Okay, last question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, we're ahead of schedule.